It was supposed to be the vacation of a lifetime, a chance to escape the everyday grind and immerse themselves in luxury aboard one of the most renowned cruise ships in the world. For Mark and Susan Richards, along with their 2 children, Alex and Lily, it was a dream come true. They had planned it for months, saved every penny, and now they were finally setting sail into the endless blue of the ocean. The sun, setting over the horizon, painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, a picture-perfect beginning to their voyage. The family spent the first day exploring the ship. The kids were thrilled with the pools and arcades, while Mark and Susan enjoyed the quiet deck, the smell of salt water in the air and the feeling of freedom. The ship's massive size was both comforting and exhilarating. It felt like a world of its own, far from the noise of everyday life. But by the second night, something felt wrong. At first, it was subtle, an unexplainable unease that seemed to creep into their minds like a shadow in the corner of their eyes. But when the sun dipped below the horizon and the ship sailed deeper into the open sea, the air became thicker, heavier, as if the ocean itself was hiding something from them. It was as if the ship wasn't just floating on the water, but being carried, pulled towards something unknown. That night, after dinner, Mark and Susan tucked the children into bed, the ship gently rocking with the waves. The family had spent a long day in the sun, and they were all ready for a good night's sleep. But as the hours passed, a strange sound broke the silence of their cabin. It started as a faint creaking, a sound that any seasoned traveler would dismiss as the natural groaning of the ship. But soon it grew louder. The creaking was accompanied by something else. Faint footsteps dragging, as if someone was walking down the hall outside their door. Mark tried to shake it off. The ship was huge, and it was probably just crew members doing their rounds. But these steps were too slow, too deliberate. They weren't the usual hurried steps of someone on duty. They sounded heavier, slower, as if whoever was walking outside had all the time in the world. He lay still in bed, hoping it would pass, but it didn't. The steps continued, getting closer to the door of their cabin. Mark's breath hitched in his chest. He turned to Susan, whose steady breathing reassured him for a moment. She was still asleep, unaware of the strange sounds creeping through the walls. Mark's gaze shifted to the door. Then the steps stopped. Knock. The sound of a single knock at the door cut through the air. The knocking wasn't frantic or urgent. It was slow, measured, deliberate. 3 knocks. 1, 2, 3. Mark sat frozen, unable to move. He didn't know why, but he felt an ice-cold dread seep into his bones. His stomach twisted into a knot as he lay in the dark, listening. The knocks came again, softer this time, almost as if whoever was knocking was waiting for something. Mark's heart raced. He stared at the door, his mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was a crew member. Maybe someone had mistakenly wandered to the wrong cabin. But why hadn't they called out or said anything? And why the long, drawn-out knocks? He forced himself to breathe, trying to calm the panic rising in his chest. Slowly, he reached the door handle, his fingers trembling. The instant his hand brushed against the cool metal, the knocking stopped. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving only silence. Mark's pulse quickened as he opened the door, his eyes scanning the dark corridor. The faint glow of the emergency lights cast long shadows, but there was no one in sight. No crew member, no late-night passenger, just an empty hallway stretching out in both directions. He stepped into the corridor, straining his ears for any sound. There was nothing, just the low hum of the ship's engines. He walked a few steps forward, calling out softly, "Hello? Is anyone there?" But the only response was the echo of his voice. The chill in the air felt unnatural, like the ship was much colder than it should have been. He turned back toward the cabin, preparing to close the door, when something caught his eye at the far end of the hallway. A figure, standing perfectly still, just beyond the reach of the emergency lights. Mark's heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall, draped in a long, dark coat, its form hidden in the shadows. But what struck him the most was its face, or the lack of one. The figure's face was smooth, blank, with no features. It wasn't a mask. It was as if the face had been erased, leaving nothing but an empty, unsettling void. Mark froze, his blood running cold. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He watched, paralyzed, as the figure remained motionless, its head tilted slightly as if observing him. Then, without warning, it moved, gliding forward with a speed and grace that was impossible for a human. Mark's heart pounded as the figure disappeared into the darkness. He stumbled backward into the cabin, slamming the door shut behind him. His breath came in sharp gasps. What had he just seen? Was it real? Susan stirred beside him, but she didn't wake up. Mark could hardly find his voice, his throat dry and tight. He wanted to tell her what he'd seen, but the words wouldn't come. Could it have been a trick of the light? Could his mind have played a cruel prank on him in the dark? He didn't know, but one thing was certain. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with the ship, and he wasn't the only one who felt it. Mark lay awake for the rest of the night, unable to sleep. Every creak of the ship, every shift of the deck under his feet, felt like an omen. Something was waiting. He didn't know what it was, but he knew it wasn't something that belonged on a cruise ship. The next morning, Mark was exhausted. He hadn't slept a wink, his mind constantly replaying the events of the night before. When Susan woke up, she seemed normal, relaxed and cheerful, unaware of the unease that had taken root in Mark's chest. He didn't tell her about the figure he had seen. Not yet. He didn't want to worry her, but the images of the featureless face lingered in his mind, chasing away any hope of peace. They spent the day exploring the ship once again. Mark tried to push the strange occurrence to the back of his mind, convincing himself that it was just the stress of travel, a product of too much sun and too little sleep. But every corner of the ship, every creaking floorboard, every flickering light felt like it was hiding something from him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the ship was more than just a cruise liner. It was something darker, something that didn't want to be discovered. As the day wore on, a strange thing started happening. Passengers seemed to disappear. It started with a couple they had seen the day before, laughing and drinking at the bar. The next morning, they were gone. No one seemed to notice at first. The crew was busy, and people were too preoccupied with their vacation to pay attention to who was missing. But as the day passed, more and more faces became unfamiliar. People that had been part of the ship's routine were simply gone. Mark asked the crew about it, but they shrugged it off. Maybe they disembarked in an earlier port, one crew member suggested. Or maybe they're just taking a day off. But Mark didn't buy it. He felt something more sinister at play, something that was lurking just beneath the surface. It wasn't until dinner that night that things truly began to unravel. The family was seated at a table near the large windows, watching the sunset bleed into the night. The vast, endless ocean stretched out before them, the only light coming from the ship's floodlights and the stars above. The tranquil beauty of the moment only made the growing sense of dread feel more pronounced. Mark couldn't stop glancing around, as if expecting someone or something to appear. And then it happened again. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable. It started from behind him, at the far side of the restaurant, and slowly grew louder, dragging along the polished floor like something heavy and deliberate. Mark stiffened. His eyes darted to the source of the sound, but when he turned, there was no one there. The steps continued, moving closer, and then, as if in response, the lights above flickered. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the silence. The sound came from the kitchen, followed by muffled shouting. Mark's heart leapt in his chest as the waiters rushed to and fro, trying to restore order. But something was different about their movements. Frantic, almost as if they were hiding something. "Sir, we're terribly sorry for the inconvenience," a waiter said, approaching their table with a forced smile. His voice was too calm, too rehearsed. "There's been a small incident in the kitchen. Please continue your meal." But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He didn't want to alarm Susan, so he kept the concerns to himself. But as the night wore on, the strange occurrences only intensified. After dinner, the family decided to take a walk on the deck, hoping the fresh sea air would clear their minds. The moon hung low over the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the deck. The ship seemed eerily quiet, and for a moment, the sound of the waves crashing against the hull was the only thing that could be heard. But then, from somewhere deep within the ship, came a scream. It wasn't the kind of scream you'd expect to hear from someone enjoying a vacation. It wasn't a scream of excitement or joy. It was a scream of sheer unfiltered terror. The kind of scream that cuts through you like a blade. Mark froze in place, his blood running cold. "Did you hear that?" he whispered to Susan, his voice trembling. She nodded slowly, her face pale. "What was that?" Before he could answer, a second scream echoed through the ship, even louder than the first. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, scraping against the walls, scratching, clawing, as if desperately trying to get out. Mark's first instinct was to run toward the sound, but he hesitated. He looked at Susan, her face a mix of confusion and fear. "Stay here," he said, his voice low but urgent. "I'll check it out." He took a few steps toward the sound, but before he could go any further, the screaming abruptly stopped. The ship seemed to go completely silent, as if the whole world had held its breath. Mark stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. He called out, but there was no response. His legs moved before his mind could process, carrying him forward to the dark, empty corridors. As he passed the crew quarters, he saw shadows flitting behind the windows, figures moving quickly and silently. When he reached the section of the ship where the screams had originated, there was nothing. The corridor was empty. The doors were all shut tight, the lights flickering overhead. No signs of anything unusual. But then, as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, just out of reach of the flickering lights. Mark's heart stopped in his chest. The figure was tall and gaunt, its skin a sickly, pale white. Its face, just like the one he had seen earlier, was completely smooth, like a blank canvas with no features. It stood completely still, as if it had been waiting for him to turn around. Mark's legs shook, and he took a step back. His breath was shallow, his mind racing. What was this thing? The figure tilted its head, and for a moment, Mark thought he saw something glimmer in the shadows, a pair of eyes staring right at him. Before he could react, the figure vanished into darkness. The panic rose in his chest again, choking him. He backed away from the corridor and ran toward the deck, desperate to get some air, to escape whatever was happening inside the ship. He found Susan standing near the railing, her face pale and filled with fear. "We need to leave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now." But as he spoke, a voice echoed across the ship, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Don't go." Mark and Susan froze. The voice was familiar but distorted, as if it was being spoken through a fog. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before fading into the wind. Mark grabbed Susan's arm, pulling her toward the stairs. "We have to find the kids. We need to get off this ship." But as they moved toward the cabin, the air grew heavier, the weight of the ship's strange presence pressing down on them. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. They were being watched, and something dark was drawing closer. As Mark and Susan hurried back toward their cabin, they were both consumed by the feeling that they were being watched. The once luxurious cruise ship now felt like a labyrinth, its vast hallways twisting and stretching in ways that didn't make sense. The walls seemed to close in, and every shadow held a secret. Mark's mind raced as he led Susan down the narrow corridor, trying to keep his thoughts focused. "We have to find the kids," he whispered, more to himself than to her. The cabin felt distant, like it was miles away. The lights flickered again, casting long, unnerving shadows across the floor. Every step they took seemed to echo, amplifying the dread that had settled in their bones. They reached the door to their room, but it was locked, just like before. The lock, which had always been sturdy and reliable, now felt alien, like it had been tampered with. Mark fumbled with the key card, his fingers trembling as he swiped it through the slot. Nothing. Frustrated, he tried again. The card slid through with a soft beep and the door swung open, but when Mark stepped inside, his blood ran cold. The room was empty. There were no signs of Alex or Lily. The beds were made, their toys neatly placed on the desk, but the children were gone. Mark's throat constricted, his stomach flipping as he scanned the room. Susan stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. "They're not here," she whispered. Mark rushed over to the balcony, his mind racing. The door was locked, He quickly checked the closets, under the beds. Nothing. Panic surged through him and his pulse raced. His eyes darted back to Susan, who was now standing motionless in the middle of the room, her gaze fixed on something across the cabin. "Mark," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look." Following her gaze, Mark's heart dropped. The walls were covered in strange markings, deep scratches, almost as if someone or something had clawed at the surface. The scratches were arranged in a pattern, stretching from floor to ceiling, as though trying to escape, as if the ship itself was trying to tear itself apart. Then Mark saw it, a small piece of paper tucked into one of the folds in the sheets on the bed. He grabbed it, his hand shaking as he unfolded it. "I'm not alone anymore." The words were written in crayon, childish but unervingly clear. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. The message was the same as the note he had found earlier in the hallway. "This isn't real," he muttered, more to himself than to Susan. But deep down he knew it was. The ship, the dark presence, the missing children, it was all connected. Suddenly, a sound echoed to the cabin, a low, guttural growl, almost like an animal. It was coming from the walls. Mark felt a chill crawl up his spine. The noise was growing louder, closer. It was as if something was inside the ship, something that didn't belong. Susan screamed, and Mark turned to see her pointing at the wall. The scratches, those strange markings, were moving. The walls were alive, trembling, the marks shifting and writhing, as if they were trying to break free. Before Mark could respond, the lights flickered once more, then went out entirely. It was a completely different ship, but the sense of dread was eerily similar. Kara had always dreamed of a luxury cruise. She had seen the brochures, those perfect pictures of sparkling blue waters, shining decks, and breathtaking sunsets. It was supposed to be the perfect honeymoon for her and her new husband, Josh. A week-long cruise through the Mediterranean. Everything seemed so ideal, so picture-perfect. The excitement had been building for months, and they were finally about to set sail. But from the moment they boarded, Kara felt off. The ship, unlike anything she had imagined, was massive. Too massive, almost like a floating city. The hallways seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, and the gleaming corridors, though beautiful, had an unsettling stillness to them. It was as if the ship was too quiet, the sound of the sea muffled by the thick walls. "Hey, are you okay?" Josh asked, noticing Kara's unease as they made their way to their cabin. "Yeah, just a little tired, I think," Kara replied, trying to shake off the feeling. But no matter how many times she tried to convince herself, it was just nerves. Something didn't feel right. The cabin was luxurious, with large windows overlooking the vast ocean. Kara and Josh settled in, unpacking their bags and preparing for the night ahead. The ship was set to leave port at midnight, and the excitement was palpable. The crew greeted them with smiles and champagne, but the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. The other passengers seemed just as nervous, looking over their shoulders, scanning the halls, almost as if they, too, could sense something was wrong. As the ship sailed into the night, Kara tried to relax. The ship's vibrations lulled her into a trance-like state. But as the hours passed, strange things began to happen. The first odd occurrence was the sound of footsteps, echoing through the halls late at night. Kara heard them every evening, but every time she opened the door to investigate, there was no one there. She asked the crew if there was a problem with the pipes or the ventilation system, but they dismissed her concerns, reassuring her that it was just the normal creaking of the ship. But Kara wasn't convinced. The footsteps weren't just the ship creaking. They were deliberate, like something was walking down the hall. Sometimes, Kara could even hear soft whispers, like distant voices, carried on the wind. One night, as the couple walked to dinner, they passed a group of passengers gathered near the bar. They looked off, tired, pale, and shaken. As Kara and Josh passed by, one of the women turned to them with wide, haunted eyes. She said something in a low, trembling voice. "Don't go below deck." The words hit Kara like a cold wave. She froze, staring at the woman. But before she could ask what she meant, the woman turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Kara couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The ship had been built for luxury, for relaxation, but now it felt more like a prison. The walls closing in, the air thick with something unnatural. That night, Kara lay in bed, her eyes darting around the room, waiting for the next strange sound. She was sure she wasn't imagining things. She could hear whispers again, muffled but distinct, as if they were coming from inside the walls. She turned to Josh, but he was asleep, unaware of the growing unease that had taken root in her chest. As the ship sailed deeper into the open ocean, Kara's fears intensified. The whispers became louder. And then one night, as the moonlight streamed through their cabin window, Kara heard something that made her blood run cold. A soft knock on the door. It was the same slow, deliberate knock that had haunted her dreams. She sat up in bed, staring at the door, her heart pounding. Josh continued to sleep, blissfully unaware of the terror that had gripped her. The knock came again. She hesitated, unsure of what to do. But then, before she could make a decision, the door slowly creaked open on its own. It was as if some invisible force had moved it, slowly, deliberately. Kara froze in terror as the door swung open, revealing the pitch-black hallway beyond. And there, standing in the doorway, was a figure, tall, shrouded in darkness and featureless, just like the others. Kara's breath hitched in her throat. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure moved, gliding toward her with an unnatural grace. It was getting closer, its presence suffocating, and Kara felt a wave of cold wash over her. Before she could react, the lights flickered and the figure vanished into the shadows. Kara grabbed Josh, shaking him awake. "Josh, wake up. We need to get off this ship. Now." Kara's heart was racing as she shook Josh awake. His eyes flickered open, confused at first, but when he saw the panic in her face, his expression changed. "What's wrong? What happened?" he asked, sitting up quickly, his voice still thick with sleep. Kara was trembling. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to explain what she had seen, but the words caught in her throat. She could barely get them out. The figure, the dark, faceless figure that had appeared at the door, was still fresh in her mind, its featureless face haunting her every thought. "Josh, I swear I saw something. Something not human. It was standing in the doorway. And then, when I blinked, it was gone." Josh sat up fully now, rubbing his face as he tried to understand. "Kara, you must have been dreaming. You're just stressed. We've been going through a lot with the wedding and the honeymoon." "I'm not imagining this," she interrupted, her voice rising in panic. "I swear to you, Josh. It was real. It was standing there in the doorway, staring at me." Josh was silent for a moment, looking at her with concern. Okay. Let's just get out of here. We'll go to the lounge, maybe grab some air. You need to calm down." But Kara wasn't sure if she could calm down. The cold fear in her chest had spread like wildfire, gnawing at her insides. The knock on the door, the way it opened by itself. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The ship, with its luxurious amenities and glossy advertisements, had turned into a nightmare. As they left the cabin, Kara's eyes darted down the hall, half expecting to see the dark figure standing at the end of it again. But the hallway was empty, the soft lighting casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twitch unnaturally. It was too quiet, too still. "We'll be fine," Josh said, trying to comfort her, but his voice lacked the confidence it once had. Even he was starting to feel it, the weight of the ship pressing down on them. They reached the lounge, hoping the noise and activity would help dispel the tension that hung thick in the air. The bar was crowded with passengers, laughing, talking, and enjoying the music that played softly in the background. Kara tried to focus on the conversation around her, but the feeling of dread didn't let up. It followed her like a shadow, always there, lurking at the edge of her consciousness. As they sat down, Kara couldn't shake the thought of the knock. Why had the door opened by itself? And what did the figure want? It couldn't have been a dream, could it? She wasn't sure anymore. Suddenly, the music in the lounge stopped. The change was so abrupt that it startled everyone. Conversations fell silent, and the clinking of glasses ceased. The entire room seemed to freeze, as if time itself had stopped. A figure appeared at the entrance of the lounge. It was tall, its silhouette outlined by the dim light from the hallway, but there was something different about it. The figure stood motionless, its back to crowd, facing the dark corridor behind it. Kara's breath caught in her throat. She didn't need to see its face to know what it was. She knew it was the same figure. Josh noticed her sudden stillness and turned to follow her gaze. His face went pale as he saw the figure, his eyes widening in horror. "What the hell?" Josh whispered. Kara grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the exit. She didn't care that people were watching them. She didn't care about anything but getting away from that thing. "Let's go now," she urged, her voice urgent. But just as they reached the door, the figure turned. Kara's blood ran cold. The face was smooth, blank. There were no eyes, no mouth, no features. Just an empty, lifeless void where a face should have been. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if it was studying them. Kara's body went rigid. She couldn't move. She couldn't look away. And then, without a sound, the figure stepped forward, gliding across the floor with an unnatural grace, as though it was floating above the ground. Kara could feel her heart racing. The air around them grew colder, thicker, as the figure drew nearer. She reached for Josh's hand, but he pulled away, his face contorted with fear. "Josh, we have to go now," Kara shouted. Before they could make a move, the figure's form flickered, and then it was gone. The lounge was still, too quiet. It was as if the figure had never been there at all. But Kara and Josh knew it had been. They had seen it with their own eyes. "We need to find the crew," Kara said, her voice trembling. "We need answers." The two of them ran through the ship, desperate to find someone who could help. As they moved through the hallways, the sounds of the ship seemed to fade. It was as if the ship itself had fallen silent, holding its breath. They found a crew member in the hall, a young man with a nervous look on his face as he walked toward them. He didn't seem to notice the terror in their eyes at first. "Excuse me," Kara said, her voice sharp with urgency. "We need to speak with the captain. Something's wrong with this ship. People are—" Before she could finish, the crew member looked at them, his eyes wide, filled with a fear Kara hadn't expected. "They know," he whispered. "They know what's happening." The words hit her like a slap. "What do you mean?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The crew member stepped closer, his voice barely audible. "You need to leave. You need to get off the ship. There are things here. Things that shouldn't be. Things." Kara asked, confused and terrified. Before the crew member could respond, another voice interrupted. "Stop. Get away from him." A senior officer rushed up, pushing the crew member aside and glaring at Kara and Josh. "What are you doing?" Officer snapped. "There's nothing wrong with this ship. You need to go back to your cabins. It's late." Kara and Josh tried protest, but the officer wasn't having it. He led them away, his expression hard and unyielding. But as he took them back toward the elevator, Kara caught a glimpse of something that made her blood run cold. In the reflection of the elevator doors, standing just behind the officer, was the dark figure. Its head was turned toward them, watching. It was right behind them. The sky was dark, the horizon barely visible as the ferry rocked gently on the sea. The Mediterranean winds blew softly against the deck, carrying the smell of salt water and the promise of adventure. It was supposed to be a normal ferry ride from one coastal town to another, just a few hours across the open water, no more than a quick hop before continuing their journey. But for David and his friends, this seemingly innocent trip was about to become a living nightmare. David had been traveling with 3 friends, all eager to explore the sights of the Mediterranean. It was a small group, just David, Rachel, and their 2 college buddies, Ben and Olivia. The plan had been simple. Spend the day in one seaside town, enjoy the local food, and take the ferry to the next destination. But things started going wrong from the moment they boarded. The ferry was much older than they had anticipated. The outside was weathered, with peeling paint and rusting metal. The inside, however, was a different story. The interior was surprisingly modern, with sleek, comfortable seating and polished floors. The ship had clearly been renovated recently, but there was something unsettling about it. It felt too clean, as if it had been too well maintained, almost artificial. As the ferry set off into the open water, David and his friends were excited, taking in the view and chatting over drinks. The night was cool, but the sea breeze was refreshing. It wasn't crowded, but there were enough people around to make it feel lively, with laughter and conversation filling the air. But as the ferry sailed farther into the water, something started to feel off. The sounds of chatter gradually faded, replaced by a creeping silence. David looked around, noticing that the few people on board had suddenly grown quiet, their faces drained of color. It was as though the ferry had crossed some invisible line, and now the atmosphere had changed. "Anyone else feel weird?" Rachel whispered, noticing how tense the air had become. David nodded, his stomach dropping. "Yeah, it's like the air's thicker. Like something's wrong." Ben laughed nervously. "You're both overthinking it. It's just the sea getting to you. You know how it messes with your head." But David couldn't shake the feeling. It was more than just a slight discomfort. It was a deep, bone-chilling dread that was slowly sinking into his chest. He tried to push aside, but the more he tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to intensify. The ferry's lights flickered once, then twice, before going completely dark. For a split second, the entire ship was plunged into darkness, the only sound the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. Then, just as quickly as it had happened, the lights flickered back on. But when they did, things had changed. The passengers, what few there were gone. David's heart skipped a beat. The deck was now eerily silent, save for the faint sound of wind. Where had everyone gone? 1 minute, the ship had been full of life, and the next, nothing. His friends were just as confused, but none of them spoke. "We need to find out what's going on," Olivia said, her voice trembling. "Where did everyone go?" The group quickly made their way toward the lower deck, hoping to find some explanation, but the place was abandoned. Empty chairs lined the corridor, the atmosphere thick with an unsettling quiet. The ship didn't feel like it was still moving, but when David checked the porthole, the ocean was still there, stretching out into the infinite dark. "It doesn't make sense," Rachel muttered, glancing nervously around. "There's no crew, no passengers. It's like..." Bang! The loud crash came from one of the lower cabins, echoing throughout the halls. Everyone jumped, their bodies tensing with fear. The sound was so sudden and violent. It felt like the ship itself had been struck by something. The group hesitated, but the curiosity won out. They followed the sound, moving cautiously down a narrow hallway that led to a staircase. Another loud noise. This time it was followed by the sound of someone scraping against the walls. It was a dry, harsh sound, like fingernails on metal. "What the hell?" Ben said, his voice shaky. "This isn't normal. We need to get off this ship." But David couldn't move. The fear had paralyzed him, and something deep inside urged him to stay, to go further into the ship. He didn't know why, but the strange magnetic pull was undeniable. They continued down the corridor, the air growing colder with each step. The scraping sounds grew louder, more frantic. It sounded like something was in agony, like it was trapped inside the ship, trying to escape. When they reached the source of the noise, they found a door slightly ajar. The scraping was coming from within. David pushed the door open, his heart racing. What he saw inside was beyond anything he could have imagined. A figure was standing in the center of the room, its back turned to them. It was tall and thin, its body unnaturally long. But what made it worse was its face, or rather, its lack of one. The figure had no facial features at all, just smooth, white skin stretched across its skull, with nothing to distinguish it as human. The scraping sound was coming from its fingers, which it was dragging along the floor as if it were searching for something. As David stared at it, his body frozen in place, the figure suddenly turned. Its head rotated with a sickening, jerky motion, like it was broken, as though its neck wasn't meant to turn that far. And then it smiled. The smile wasn't human. It was wide, impossibly so, stretching from ear to ear. There was no warmth, no kindness, just an empty void behind that grin. And with that smile came a voice. "You shouldn't have come." The words reverberated in David's mind, sending a shock of terror through him. His legs felt like they were made of stone, but somehow he managed to stumble backward. His friends were just as paralyzed, their eyes locked on the figure as it took a slow, deliberate step toward them. That was when the ship seemed to lurch. A deep, grinding sound came from below the deck, and the entire ferry shook violently. The lights flickered once more, and the figure vanished. They didn't wait for it to return. They ran. The rest of the journey was a blur of confusion and panic. They found their way to the deck, and in the distance, they saw another boat, another ferry, but this one was far off, flickering on the horizon. It was their only hope. As they scrambled to get to the lifeboats, they saw more of the figures. They were standing at the edge of the ship, watching, their empty faces grinning in the dark. The last thing David remembered before he passed out was hearing the voice again, the same voice that had whispered to him earlier. "You shouldn't have come." David came to with a taste of salt water in his mouth and the sound of gulls circling overhead. His vision was blurred, but when he blinked, he realized he was no longer on the ferry. He was on a small lifeboat, drifting aimlessly in the morning light. The sea around him was calm, almost too calm, and the sun was rising at the edge of the horizon. His head throbbed as he sat up, his heart racing. The memories of the night before came crashing back. The faceless figure, the voice, the violent lurch of the ship. His stomach twisted as he glanced around the lifeboat. Rachel was there beside him, her face pale and lifeless, though her chest rose and fell slowly. She was alive, just unconscious. But Ben and Olivia, they were gone. "Rachel," David whispered, shaking her shoulder. She groaned, her eyes fluttering open, and for a moment, relief washed over him. But when she sat up and looked at him, something wasn't right. Her face, her eyes were sunken, as though something had hollowed them out. Her lips curled into a faint, too wide smile, the same kind of unnatural smile the faceless figure had worn. "David," she whispered in a voice that wasn't hers. It was distorted, echoing, carrying the same chilling cadence he had heard on the ship. "You shouldn't have come." David's blood ran cold. He scrambled back to the far edge of the lifeboat, his chest heaving as Rachel's smile widened. For a moment, he thought he could see something moving just beneath her skin, something writhing as though it wanted out. He shook his head violently. No, this isn't real. This isn't you." But the voice came again, this time echoing inside his head, so clearly it felt like it was coming from his own thoughts. "There is no escape. You belong to the sea now." The ocean around them rippled, and David realized with horror that the ferry, the same massive, rusted vessel, was out there again, standing eerily still in the distance. It hadn't sunk. It hadn't disappeared. It was waiting. Rachel's body convulsed suddenly, and her hands clawed at the sides of the lifeboat as though something was pulling her back toward the sea. David lunged forward to hold her, but the moment he touched her, her skin turned ice cold. She looked up at him, her smile vanishing, her real voice breaking through for a single, desperate second. "Run," she croaked, and then she was yanked over the side of the lifeboat with a violent splash. The water swallowed her whole, leaving David screaming her name into the empty sea. He was alone. For hours he drifted under the blistering sun, his throat dry, his eyes stinging. The ferry never drew closer, but it never vanished either. It loomed on the horizon like a predator, waiting patiently for its prey to weaken. Eventually, another boat appeared, this one a small fishing vessel. The crew pulled David aboard, their faces kind but wary. They asked what had happened, where his friends were, why he was out here alone. David wanted to tell them everything, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't know how to explain the faceless figure, the voice, the way Rachel had changed. Instead, he muttered something about a storm, about people falling overboard. The fishermen exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing more. That night, when they docked at the nearest port, David was taken to a hospital. He lay in the sterile bed, the sound of the waves crashing faintly against the shore outside. He should have felt safe. He should have been grateful to be alive. But as he drifted toward sleep, he heard it again, that same voice echoing from somewhere far beyond the walls. "You shouldn't have come." And when he opened his eyes, he swore he saw the reflection of a faceless figure in the darkened hospital window, watching, waiting, smiling. The fairy hadn't let him go. It never would.